I was trying to handle my divorce with dignity until my mother-in-law cornered me at a family gathering. She jabbed her finger into my chest and hissed that I deserved to be cheated on. "Lauren only strayed because you're so pathetic. She needed a real man for once." The room fell silent as everyone stared. I stayed calm and replied, "That makes sense, actually." Before adding, "I guess that explains why she was sleeping with your husband, Diane." The color drained from her face as she realized her perfect daughter had been having an affair with her own father. Let me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had the perfect comeback at exactly the right moment. To understand why this confrontation was so satisfying, you need to know the full story of my relationship with Lauren and her family. We met in our final year of college, both studying business administration at the same university. Lauren was beautiful, ambitious, and charismatic. Everything I thought I wanted in a partner. We dated for 2 years before getting engaged, and married 6 months after that in a lavish ceremony that her parents Diane and Richard insisted on paying for. From the beginning, my relationship with my in-laws was complicated. Diane was a force of nature, a former beauty queen who had transitioned into running a successful interior design business. She micromanaged every aspect of her family's life, including our wedding, which morphed from our vision of a simple gathering to a 300-guest extravaganza that felt more like a networking event for her business than a celebration of our love. Richard, by contrast, was quiet and seemingly content to let Diane run the show. A successful investment banker, he provided the financial backing for his wife's dominant personality. He was always friendly to me, offering advice on investments and career moves, but there was something performative about his warmth, as if he was playing the role of supportive father-in-law rather than genuinely connecting. Lauren was clearly her mother's daughter. She had been raised to believe she deserved only the best, and Diane had instilled in her a sense of entitlement that occasionally surfaced in our relationship. Early on, I found these moments of princess behavior charming, even amusing. It wasn't until we were married that I realized how deeply ingrained these patterns were. The first 2 years of marriage were relatively smooth. We both launched our careers, bought our first home with a generous down payment gift from her parents that came with invisible strings attached, and began building a life together. Lauren worked as a marketing executive for a luxury brand, while I joined a financial consulting firm that required occasional travel. Looking back, I can see the warning signs that began to emerge in our 3rd year together. Lauren became increasingly critical of my career progress, unfavorably comparing me to her father or her friends' husbands, who had more prestigious positions or higher salaries. When I suggested we start thinking about having children, she was dismissive, saying we needed to be more established first, though we were already more financially secure than most couples our age. Diane's influence became more pronounced during this period. She would drop by unannounced while I was away on business trips, and Lauren and I would often argue after these visits. My wife would suddenly find fault with our home decor, our financial decisions, or my work hours, all topics I knew she had recently discussed with her mother. It was around our 4th anniversary that I noticed more concrete changes in Lauren's behavior. She began guarding her phone, zealously changing passwords and positioning the screen away from me when texting. She started working later, joining new gym classes and attending networking events that seemed to have no connection to her actual professional network. The classic signs were all there, but I was deep in denial, making excuses and focusing on my own demanding job. The moment of truth came on a Tuesday in March. I had returned early from what was supposed to be a 3-day business trip to Boston when my meetings wrapped up ahead of schedule. Rather than texting Lauren about my early return, I decided to surprise her with dinner from her favorite restaurant. When I arrived home around 7 in the evening, I noticed an unfamiliar luxury sedan parked a few houses down from ours. Something about it triggered my suspicion, but I dismissed the feeling as paranoia born from months of growing distance between us. I entered our home quietly, carrying the takeout bags, and heard Lauren's laughter coming from upstairs, followed by a deep male voice that sent a chill through me. I stood frozen at the bottom of the staircase, suddenly certain of what I would find but unable to process it. For a brief, irrational moment, I considered leaving the food and walking out pretending I had never come home early. Instead, I forced myself to climb the stairs, each step feeling like I was moving through concrete. The bedroom door was partially open. From the hallway, I could see reflections in our mirrored closet doors enough to confirm my worst fears without subjecting myself to a full view. Lauren was in our bed with a man I recognized. I cleared my throat loudly. The sounds of hushed conversation and movement instantly stopped. "Lauren," I called out, my voice steadier than I expected. "I'm home early, and it seems like I'm interrupting something." What followed was a blur of chaotic moments. Lauren wrapped in our bedsheet, her face a mask of shock, and then calculated damage control. Richard, my father-in-law, scrambling to gather his clothes from the floor. My own strange, detached calm as I set the food containers on the hallway table and said I got dinner from Castellino's. "Seems like you've already worked up an appetite." I left the house without waiting for explanations or excuses, driving aimlessly for hours before checking into a hotel. During that drive, I cycled through every emotion imaginable: rage, devastation, humiliation, and bizarrely occasional moments of inappropriate laughter at the sheer audacity of the situation. My wife was having an affair with her own father-in-law in our bed, while her mother had been unknowingly pushing us together at family functions for years. The next day, I received dozens of calls and texts from Lauren, ranging from apologetic to accusatory. "It just happened. We didn't mean to hurt anyone. If you had been more attentive. It was only physical. You've been so distant lately." The classical cheater's script, but with the twisted element that her affair partner was her mother's husband. I refused to engage beyond a brief message: "I'll be by on Saturday to collect some of my things. Please be elsewhere." I also contacted a divorce attorney and began the process of documenting everything, following their advice to communicate only in writing when possible. Lauren apparently told her mother about the separation, but crafted a very different narrative. According to mutual friends who reached out to check on me, she had claimed that I was the one who had been unfaithful, and that our marriage had been troubled for some time due to my emotional unavailability and workaholism. It seemed easier for her to villainize me than to admit the truth about herself and her father. For several weeks, this false narrative prevailed within their social circle. I made no effort to correct it, focusing instead on the practical matters of separation, financial disentanglement, finding a new place to live, and trying to maintain my professional performance despite my personal life imploding. I told only my closest friends and my immediate family, the truth swearing them to discretion, not out of any loyalty to Lauren or her parents, but because I was still processing my own feelings about the situation. Richard, meanwhile, had apparently convinced Lauren that they had a future together. According to a mutual friend who remained loyal to me, he had promised to leave Diane once the dust settled. Lauren, who had always idolized her father and sought his approval, seemed to believe these promises despite the clear evidence of his character that his affair with his daughter's wife provided. This was the volatile situation brewing when I encountered Diane at her sister's birthday celebration 3 months after my discovery. I had only attended out of respect for Lauren's aunt, who had always been kind to me, and had reached out personally to say she valued my presence in the family, regardless of what was happening between her niece and me. I had no idea that Diane or Lauren would be there, having been assured by the aunt that they had declined the invitation. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a warm Saturday evening in June. I had arrived at Janet's birthday celebration, Lauren's aunt, and one of the few members of her family who had shown me genuine kindness throughout our relationship. Janet had specifically assured me that Lauren and her parents would not be attending, as they had already declined due to a charity event Diane was involved with. I was chatting with Janet's husband by the outdoor bar when a commotion near the entrance caught my attention. Diane had arrived alone and clearly agitated. She scanned the gathering until her eyes locked on me, and her expression transformed from irritation to cold fury. Before I could excuse myself or prepare for what was coming, she was striding across the patio toward me, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the stonework. "You have some nerve showing your face here," she hissed loud enough for nearby guests to turn and stare. "After what you did to my daughter." Janet quickly appeared at my side, placing a hand on Diane's arm. "This is not the time or place, Diane. I invited Thomas specifically because he's still family to us." Family, Diane scoffed, shaking off her sister's hand. "He destroyed my daughter's marriage with his neglect and God knows what else. Lauren is absolutely devastated." I remained silent, unwilling to create a scene at Janet's birthday celebration. My restraint only seemed to infuriate Diane further. "Nothing to say for yourself?" she demanded, stepping closer until she was uncomfortably in my personal space. "Too much of a coward to even defend your actions, Diane. I'm not going to discuss my marriage at a birthday party," I said quietly. "I think it's best if we—" "Of course you will not discuss it," she interrupted, her voice rising further. "Because you know exactly what you did. Lauren told me everything about how cold and absent you were, how you prioritized work over her for years, how you made her feel invisible in her own marriage." By now, a small circle had formed around us, guests pretending not to eavesdrop while obviously hanging on every word. Janet was trying unsuccessfully to guide her sister away from the confrontation. I decided the best approach was to simply leave, and I began to excuse myself. That's when Diane delivered the line that stopped me in my tracks, jabbing her manicured finger into my chest for emphasis. "She only cheated because you are pathetic. My daughter deserved a real man for once in her life." The patio fell, completely silent. I felt a strange calm wash over me, a moment of perfect clarity amidst the months of chaos and pain. Diane stood before me, breathing heavily, a triumphant gleam in her eyes at having publicly denounced me. She clearly expected me to either slink away in shame or explode in anger, either reaction confirming her narrative of me as either a coward or an unstable partner. Instead, I nodded thoughtfully and replied in a measured tone, "That makes sense, actually." Confusion flickered across her face clearly, not the response she had anticipated. I continued, my voice even but audible to everyone in the vicinity. "I guess that explains why she was sleeping with your husband, Diane." The effect was immediate and electric. Diane's expression collapsed from righteous anger to shocked disbelief in an instant. Color drained from her face so rapidly that for a moment I worried she might faint. Around us, gasps and murmurs rippled through the onlookers. "What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice suddenly frail. "Lauren was having an affair with Richard." I stated plainly. "That's who I caught her with in our bed. Your husband, her father." I hadn't intended to reveal this publicly, but Diane's attack had forced my hand. "You're lying," she said. But there was no conviction in her voice, just the desperate denial of someone confronting an unthinkable truth. "I wish I were," I replied sincerely. "I found them together 3 months ago when I came home early from a business trip. That's why I left. Not because of anything I did." Diane swayed slightly on her feet, and Janet quickly moved to support her sister. The crowd around us had grown drawn by the undisguised drama unfolding. Someone pressed a glass of water into Diane's hand, which she stared at blankly before setting it down untouched. "This cannot be true," she said, finally, though her tone suggested she already knew it was. "Richard would never. Lauren would never." "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I took no pleasure in Diane's pain. "I never planned to tell you publicly. But I will not stand here and be accused of destroying a marriage that Lauren and Richard shattered themselves." The aftermath was chaotic. Diane left abruptly, ignoring Janet's attempts to comfort her. Several guests approached me awkwardly, offering condolences or asking uncomfortable questions that I deflected politely. Janet apologized profusely for the scene, though it had clearly been beyond her control. "I had no idea," she kept saying. "Lauren told us all that you had been unfaithful, that you left her for someone from your office." "That's not what happened," I confirmed quietly. "But I didn't want to drag everyone into our mess. I just wanted a clean break and to move forward." "Does Richard know that you know?" Janet asked, her expression still stunned from the revelation. Yes, he was there when I discovered them. We haven't spoken since. But he's aware that I know exactly who destroyed my marriage. I left the party shortly after knowing that by morning the truth would have spread through their entire social circle. The story was simply too scandalous to contain. As I drove home to my new apartment, I felt an unexpected lightness. Not happiness, the wounds were still too fresh for that, but relief at no longer carrying the burden of undeserved blame. The next 24 hours brought a flurry of calls and messages as the news rippled outward. Friends who had distanced themselves based on Lauren's narrative reached out with apologies. Lauren herself sent a lengthy self-justifying text that somehow managed to avoid taking responsibility while still admitting the affair had happened. Richard remained silent. And, from Diane, nothing at all. It wasn't until 3 days later that I heard what had happened in the immediate aftermath of the party. According to Janet, who called to check on me, Diane had gone directly to their family home and confronted Richard, who had initially tried to deny everything before finally admitting to the affair. He claimed it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that spiraled out of control. Lauren, summoned by her mother for an emergency family meeting, had broken down and confirmed everything, though she placed the blame squarely on Richard, claiming he had pursued her relentlessly and she had been vulnerable due to problems in our marriage. The truth, as is often the case, likely lay somewhere in the complicated middle of these narratives. I would never know exactly how their affair had begun or who had initiated it, nor did I particularly care anymore. The betrayal was the same, regardless of those details. What I did learn was that Diane had thrown Richard out that very night, changing the locks and calling her lawyer before morning. Lauren, rather than finding support from her father now that everything was in the open, discovered that Richard had no intention of leaving his wealthy wife for his daughter-in-law. In fact, he was already negotiating with Diane's attorney, offering a generous settlement to avoid the public humiliation of having the true reason for their divorce made official in court documents. Lauren, abandoned by her father and ostracized by her mother, tried repeatedly to contact me in the following weeks. Her messages evolved from blame to partial admission of guilt to desperate appeals for reconciliation. "We can get past this," she wrote in one particularly delusional email. "Everyone makes mistakes, and now that it's all in the open, we could start fresh with complete honesty." I never responded to these overtures, maintaining the advice from my attorney to communicate only through legal channels while our divorce proceeded. The court process, which I had feared would be contentious and drawn out, moved surprisingly quickly once Lauren realized I had documented evidence of her infidelity, and she stood to lose significantly more by fighting me than by agreeing to my reasonable terms. The 6 months following the confrontation with Diane brought dramatic changes to everyone involved. My divorce was finalized with terms that were fair to both parties, largely because Lauren had finally recognized the precariousness of her position and stopped fighting every detail. She had moved to another state, according to mutual friends, taking a job transfer to escape the social fallout of her actions. Richard and Diane's divorce proceedings were considerably more complicated and bitter. Despite his initial attempts to negotiate, Diane ultimately pursued the nuclear option, making sure their separation documents explicitly stated his infidelity with his daughter's wife as the cause. Her attorney was ruthlessly effective, and Richard, once so financially powerful and socially respected, found himself with significantly diminished assets and completely excluded from their former social circle. The collateral damage extended beyond the 4 primary people involved. Family gatherings became diplomatic nightmares, with relatives forced to choose sides or attempt uncomfortable neutrality. Friends found themselves awkwardly navigating divided loyalties. Lauren's younger brother, who had always looked up to his father, struggled to process the betrayal of both his sister and his father, eventually seeking therapy to deal with the family implosion. For my part, I focused on rebuilding my life piece by piece. I threw myself into work, initially earning a promotion that had previously seemed just out of reach. I sold the house that Lauren and I had shared, unable to feel comfortable in spaces that now held such painful memories. The new condominium I purchased was entirely my own choice, with no influence from in-laws or compromise with a partner's different tastes. The hardest adjustment wasn't the practical changes, but the emotional fallout. Trust, which had once come naturally to me, became something I approached cautiously. I found myself analyzing interactions and questioning motivations in ways that were foreign to my previously open nature. Therapy helped, providing tools to process the betrayal without allowing it to fundamentally change who I was or how I engaged with the world. Dating again seemed impossible for the first year after the divorce. Well-meaning friends attempted to set me up, and colleagues occasionally suggested introductions, but I politely declined, knowing I wasn't ready. When I eventually did agree to a coffee date with a woman I met through a community volunteer project, I was surprised by how normal it felt. Just two people getting to know each other without the shadows of my past relationship immediately intruding. Melissa was different from Lauren in almost every way. Where Lauren had been polished and status-conscious, Melissa was authentic and grounded. Her work as a pediatric nurse reflected her natural compassion, and her straightforward communication style was refreshingly direct after years of navigating Lauren's complex emotional landscapes. We took things slowly, building a foundation of friendship before allowing the relationship to evolve into something deeper. Meeting her family brought unexpected anxiety. The memory of my last set of in-laws creating trepidation about forming connections with another partner's parents. But here, too, the differences were stark. Her mother and father, married for 35 years, related to each other with gentle teasing and obvious affection. They welcomed me without the evaluating gaze I had grown accustomed to from Diane, interested in knowing me as a person rather than assessing my suitability or status. One evening, about 2 years after the confrontation at Janet's party, I ran into Diane at a restaurant in a neighboring city where I was having dinner with clients. She was dining alone, and our eyes met as I was walking toward the exit. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded in acknowledgement, and I returned the gesture before continuing on my way. There was nothing to say, no relationship to repair or maintain. Just two people who had once been connected through others, now living entirely separate lives. Janet, who had remained friendly with me despite the family complications, later mentioned that Diane had finally found some measure of peace. "She will never forgive either of them," Janet said during one of our occasional catch-up calls, but she's stopped letting it consume her entire life. She's dating someone new, actually. A widower she met through church. I was genuinely glad to hear it. Despite the harsh words Diane and I had exchanged, I had never wished continued suffering on her. She too had been betrayed by the people closest to her, and that kind of pain doesn't discriminate based on how likable or difficult someone might be. As for Lauren and Richard, their futures remained largely unknown to me. Lauren had apparently attempted reconciliation with her mother, according to Janet, but Diane had maintained firm boundaries, willing to have occasional contact, but unwilling to fully welcome her daughter back into her life. Richard had moved to Florida, remarried quickly to someone much younger, and rarely contacted any members of his former family. Looking back now with the perspective of time and healing, I can see that the confrontation with Diane, though uncomfortable in public, was actually the catalyst for genuine positive change in my life. It forced the truth into the open, clearing away the false narrative that had protected Lauren and Richard while casting me as the villain. It allowed me to stop carrying the undeserved burden of blame for our failed marriage. And most importantly, it freed everyone involved to face reality and begin the difficult but necessary process of moving forward. The greatest lesson I learned through all of this wasn't about marriage or infidelity or even trust, though those were certainly significant themes. Rather, it was about the importance of standing in your truth even when doing so is difficult or painful. I had initially kept silent about the real reason for our separation, believing I was taking the high road. But that silence had allowed others to control the narrative, creating a distorted version of reality that caused additional harm. When I finally spoke my truth, not in anger or vengeance, but in simple factual terms, it set in motion a cascade of necessary consequences. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do, both for ourselves and ultimately for others, is to stop protecting people from the reality of their own actions. Today, my life bears little resemblance to the one I had planned with Lauren. It is in many ways smaller and quieter, less focused on appearances and achievements, more centered on genuine connections and personal contentment. Melissa and I are now engaged, planning a simple ceremony that reflects our shared values rather than external expectations. Her family has become a source of unexpected joy in my life, showing me what healthy family relationships can look like. The scars remain, of course. Trust comes harder. Certain triggers can still momentarily transport me back to that devastating moment of discovery. But these wounds no longer define my daily experience or limit my capacity for happiness. They are simply part of the complex history that has shaped who I am today, someone who has been broken but found his own way to become whole again. Have you ever experienced a moment where speaking your truth completely changed the trajectory of a difficult situation? How did you handle the aftermath? And what did you learn about yourself in the process? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your insights might help someone else currently struggling with whether to maintain painful silence or speak difficult truths. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more reflections on navigating life's unexpected challenges. Share with someone who might need permission to stand in their truth, even when doing so disrupts comfortable illusions. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember that while healing is rarely linear, it is always possible when we face reality with courage and compassion.